While President Biden spent the week in Europe meeting with allies, his predecessor has been insisting that Ukraine would be better off if he was still in the Oval Office.
What we can do is enormous, and we should be doing it, and we should be helping them to survive. And they're doing an amazing job. But, you know, I was the one that sent in the javelins. I mean, everyone refuses to acknowledge that, and I took a lot of heat. And I sent it in very openly and glowingly.
Okay, so if that reference to javelins rings a bell, it's because those exact weapons were the center of Trump's first impeachment trial. See, back in 2019, he tried to leverage those same Javelin anti-tank weapons over Ukraine in exchange for a made-up scandal about Joe Biden's son. Y'all remember that. Chris, Jen, and Eugene are still with us. So, Chris, Trump's big plan for countering Russia's invasion would be to threaten to drop a nuclear bomb on Russia. Okay, so it seems kind of obvious, but it's Saturday night. So can you explain why that's a terrible idea?
Well, I don't think anyone wants a nuclear war between the United States and Russia. We've certainly heard a lot of nuclear threats from President Putin the past couple of weeks, who's put his nuclear forces on high alert and threatened to escalate if Russia feels threatened in a conflict. I think it's definitely fair to say that the U.S. ought to be pushing back more aggressively against Putin's nuclear threats, reminding the Russians that, of course, the U.S. has a comparable arsenal and that Russia shouldn't think about using any type of nuclear forces, whether in Ukraine or anywhere else in the world. It's dangerous rhetoric from the Russians, and I think they ought to be put back in their place and reminded that they're not the only country with a substantial nuclear force.
So, Jen, this isn't the first time the former President Trump has hinted about a secret plan. In 2016, if you recall, he said he had a secret plan to defeat ISIS, but it never really was revealed or materialized. So who believes this stuff anymore? I mean, what's the point of all of this?
This is just his natural self-aggrandizement and just red meat for the base. I want to just remind your viewers, Donald Trump tried to extort President Zelensky, the same guy who is now an international hero. Donald Trump was strong-arming him, denying him weapons so that, as you said, he could kick up some kind of dirt on now President Biden. Every Republican who went along with that, every Republican who voted to acquit him and Trump have a moral stain, and they contributed to a sense that Putin had, that America was not really all that enamored of NATO, that they weren't going to stand with them, that he could waltz into Ukraine and somehow separate them from their European allies. So just a little bit of history there. As far as Putin goes, he and Trump were joined at the hip. Let's not forget that Trump was really the best propaganda minister that the Russians have had in many, many years. He provided all kinds of justifications for everything from their seizure of Crimea all the way back to their invasion of Afghanistan. So this is just a lot of memory holding and an attempt to whitewash history. But I think it's important for all of us to remember what he did and what Republicans did to, frankly, alienate and isolate Ukraine at a time just as it is now, that they badly needed our unwavering support.
So, Eugene, speaking of history, watching President Biden with NATO leaders this week, I really could not help but think about Trump's visit to NATO in 2017. Now, if you recall, he shoved the prime minister of Montenegro out of the way on camera. Now, the question is, how do you think our NATO allies are viewing this moment that Trump's not there? He's not the one in charge during this particular war.
One of the things that leaders of countries really like America to have is kind of stable rhetoric, to have a president who is consistent in the things that he says, and most importantly, a president who likes NATO, right? And Donald Trump spent years talking down to NATO countries, saying that they weren't doing enough, talking about and threatening to pull the United States out of NATO. And so they are more at home with Biden. You can look at the way that they're talking with him at trips earlier this year, despite some of the kerfuffles they've had over the time period at the beginning of last year when he was with Emmanuel Macron, when he was talking with some of these other leaders. There's more of a comfort there, and that's very obvious because of the way that Donald Trump has talked about NATO in the past, and frankly how he continues to talk about NATO. And to add to Jennifer's history lesson there, in 2014. When Putin took Crimea, part of Ukraine, what used to be part of Ukraine, Trump praised him, right, and continued to praise him at CPAC, continued to praise him in 2016 for the same thing. And so that is something that when leaders of NATO countries look at how President Biden has handled what's been going on, how he's brought them together, and whether politicians here in the United States like that idea that they're praising him, that is what they're doing. They're talking about how he helped to build this coalition together, to have countries do things that they hadn't done before, including giving weapons to Ukraine, something that like Germany, for example, had not really wanted to do, and how they think Trump would have handled it, right? Talking about his secret plans and those plans being kind of dangerous and would up the ante for sure if he were president, those things were to happen.
Christopher Miller, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate you being with us. And Jen and Eugene, stick with us. We've got a lot coming up. Next, should Clarence Thomas rescue himself from January 6th related cases? Now that we know his wife wanted to overturn the 2020 election? Well, we'll talk about that and more with our panel.